All right. Okay, Matt.
Yes, how are you doing?
You're welcome. To this podcast, it's been 1 year of you telling me we should do this, right?
Well, it's been about probably a year and a half
Yeah.
of me telling you should do it. And you've justifiably said if I'm going to do it, you're going to be a part of it at least once.
Exactly.
So here I am.
Yeah.
But I am glad that you are doing it overall because I think you have a lot of interesting insight that maybe people don't always consider. And I think you're well spoken, so I'm excited to be able to see the future of where this podcast goes with you.
Cool. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of it. And
Sure.
you are our first guest.
Oh, I feel special.
I feel honored that you accepted this invitation. Okay,
Thank
so
you for having me.
you're welcome. So the idea of the podcast is to figure out how culture and culture conceptualized in broad terms sort of comes with some vulnerabilities.
Yes.
How culture creates vulnerabilities in our private lives and our, maybe even in our employment, professional life, educational life, maybe,
Yeah.
or even within the family itself,
Mhm.
within the society as well. What are some of the vulnerabilities that we face that we can attribute to culture? Again, what are some aspects of our lives that we can say we are able to build upon some resilience
Mhm.
that we get from our cultures. So for today, I wanted us to have a conversation, particularly about your military experience
Sure.
and how your culture was able to. How would you would say? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but how would you conceptualize your experience and maybe explain to us how your culture played a role in terms of building the resilience that you needed to be a successful soldier, and also any kind of vulnerabilities that you feel like you faced going through that career path.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any question before we get going?
Not at the moment, but
Okay.
I'll let you know if they come up.
All right, cool. All right, so since this is we're gonna be talking about a lot of things that relate to our cultures.
Mhm.
Perhaps let's start with a little background about you.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I grew up in New England, northeast of the United States, and I spent probably roughly 12 and a half years of my life there. And then my family moved to Pennsylvania, in southwest Pennsylvania, about 8 hours from where I originally grew up. So there was a little bit of a kind of culture shock there. So of course in America, we have like the dominant broader American culture, and then in the Northeast it's very different than the Southwest and very different than the Northwest, and all these different things. So it was moving from more of a suburban area to a little bit closer to a major city and different state with kind of a different approach to life was definitely a little bit of a culture shock. And then from there, I lived in that area of Pennsylvania for probably like 5 years. And then as soon as I was old enough, I graduated high school and I enlisted in the Army, where there was its own set of kind of a co-culture or subculture. There's its own organizational culture. And then I did 5 years in the Army. I did active duty, and I did those 5 years were spent in the Army infantry, which you could certainly make an argument that the infantry has its own kind of culture compared to other jobs, or we call them MOSs, military occupational specialties, so different jobs within the Army, different cultures across different branches of the military. So after I did 5 years in the Army, I got out and didn't really know what to do with my life after not being in the Army anymore. I'd never really kind of thought that far ahead. So I ended up coming back to school, went to West Virginia University and majored in communication studies, and kind of fell in love with it unexpectedly. Decided to do a master's. While I was in the master's program here at WVU again is where I met you, because you had just started your PhD here. And then a year later, I started the PhD program myself, and now here we are having a chat on a podcast.
That's great. You did mention that you had some sort of culture shock, and this was around age 5.
Oh no, not age 5. Probably about age 12, 13. Yeah.
Okay. Now tell us a little bit about this culture shock that you're talking about. What was different from your previous environment that you feel like was different in your new environment?
Yeah. So one thing was dialect was definitely different,
Okay.
which might be a little bit cultural, might be a little bit geographical. Probably a blend of both, but the way that people talked where we had ended up moving to in Pennsylvania was very different. There was different slang. There was just different dialect and pronunciations of words as well. So that was interesting because all of a sudden I felt like I talked normal my whole life, and then I was surrounded by people who talked differently. And to me, I was like, why are they talking weird? But to everybody else, they were like, why are you talking weird? You're the only one that's not like us. You don't say the same slang that we say. We don't. You don't pronounce words the same way we pronounce them.
Yeah.
So that was a little shocking. But also, when I was growing up in New England, I was in a very diverse area.
Okay.
There was people from all sorts of ethnic and racial backgrounds, which was very interesting because there's a lot of subcultures and co-cultures kind of present
Mm-hmm.
that were tied to ethnic heritage
Mm-hmm.
and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
and nationalities.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we moved to an area that was just outside of a major city that was, well, very demographically similar,
Okay.
to, like, everybody in the area was the same as everybody else.
Okay.
There was not a lot of racial diversity. There was not a lot of ethnic diversity. Not a ton. There was certainly some cognitive diversity, but not a ton. So that was a shock as well. Especially, it kind of sucked to go to an area where everyone was so demographically like homogenous and similar.
Mm-hmm.
I missed out on a lot of the good food from different countries and
Okay.
different like a lot of people would immigrate to the area that I grew up in initially,
Yeah.
and there would be really good food
Yeah.
that they would bring from their countries. So yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, those would probably be some of
Okay.
the main
Okay.
culture shocks that occurred there.
Okay. Now, a lot of times, our culture shock, even if you are still within your own community,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it takes situations where you have to intermingle
Mm-hmm.
with people from other backgrounds
Yeah.
in order to figure out that, oh man, okay, there are some differences in terms of how people behave, how people, basically the cultural differences will become much more prominent to you when you
Right.
engage with people from different backgrounds. And I think for a lot of children,
Mm-hmm.
school is one point where they are exposed to these cultural differences.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes up until that time they are probably with their families,
Mm-hmm.
and so really what they know is what the family represents to them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So when they go to school, then that's where they kind of are able to be exposed to different people and different cultures. So now my question is, in terms of, in your description of the culture shock, when you went to when you moved,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm assuming that you moved, you changed schools.
Yes.
Yes. Did you feel, how were you able to fit in? Let's start from there. How were you able to fit in? And did you feel like there was, did you experience that culture diversity in the new school?
I did not experience a ton of cultural diversity in the new school. As I kind of alluded to, the area that we had moved to was much less diverse. There was much more similarity amongst the people that live there
Okay.
than I think I was used to growing
Okay.
up in New
Okay.
England.
Okay.
You know, I grew up like an hour, 2 hours from Ellis Island, so
Okay.
there's been a history of people immigrating there, and of course, you know, they then have their own children, and their
Yeah.
children have children,
Yeah.
and culture spreads, and
Yeah.
that whole thing.
Yeah.
When I moved to the new district, of course, you know, there was some similarities, or were some similarities, because it was still America. It was still generally the same region of the country, but I would say I didn't really work too hard to assimilate.
Okay.
In fact, I probably worked harder at asserting that I was different and that's okay. Because I did feel quite different. Granted, there was a lot of like on the surface similarities. It was like a very demographically white area. It was mostly white people, mostly upper middle class, a lot of similarity in socioeconomic status and things like that. But I wasn't used to necessarily being around quite as many affluent people. And my family was never necessarily like struggling, right? But we certainly weren't as well off as a lot of the other families that were in the new area.
Okay.
So I think that was a little bit of a mark of difference. At one point I was dropped off in school, and I had kids like, "Why the hell does your family have that car?" And I was like, "What do you mean it drives? Like, I didn't buy it." Like,
So they meant to say that it's an old car, you should not be driving it, or what do they mean by that?
basically, yeah. It's why does your family have a nicer car? You know,
Okay.
in the school district that we had moved into, there was a lot of emphasis placed on kind of like the material artifacts
Okay.
of culture, material markers of
Okay.
success and status.
Okay.
So that was like one thing. Interestingly enough, there was some strife in my social life because I wasn't a fan of like the same sports teams, which, you know, I definitely probably fought that battle a little bit harder than I might have wanted to, if, looking back. But, you know, I was so adamant that it was okay that I'm different, and I would still, you know, say that differences are okay in the vast majority of contexts. But, you know, kids can be cruel.
Yeah.
Kids can, so we didn't necessarily connect on certain things that I was able to connect with a little bit more peacefully in the area that I grew up. And sports is just kind of
Okay.
one example.
Yeah.
But yeah, does that answer your
Yes,
question? I feel like I kind of went down a tangent there.
No. But our audience want to see you a little more. So.
Okay.
Okay, so if you could turn a little bit. Exactly.
How's this?
Yeah,
Alright.
exactly. So this idea of I'm different and I'm okay with it.
Yes.
Where did that idea come from?
I think part of it grew out of the notion from just growing up in a very diverse area. Growing up in such a diverse area, my family had instilled in me very early on, and the schools that I was in had instilled in me very early on, that, you know, there are people that are different, and a lot of the differences are fairly trivial, right? It doesn't make them a better or worse person necessarily because they believe something differently, or because they approach a situation differently,
Absolutely.
they look differently, different abilities, right? So that was certainly part of where I got that kind of like acceptance towards some of the difference there. And then also I grew up in a very religious home, and I'm not particularly religious these days, but there are certain things that I would say still kind of stick with me from growing up in a religious home. And one of the things that I think does stick with me is, even though I know Christianity gets a bad rap because a lot of Christians these days are not so tolerant of difference, the kind of branch of Christianity that I belonged to, and the view that my family and the churches that I grew up in took, was that, you know, we're all God's children, we're different, but that's okay. You know, like difference doesn't necessarily mean that they're not inherently bad. Differences aren't inherently bad. They might just mean we have different purposes in life or different background, that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. Cool. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing your background story
Sure.
with us. That's so wonderful. Now, okay, so we will transition into some of the decisions that went into joining the military. What were some of the considerations for getting into the military?
That's a tough one, honestly, primarily because it was, as long as I can remember, that's what I had wanted to do. I had said, that's my plan for life, that is my goal, that's my purpose. Like ever since I knew what the military was, I can remember pretty much
Okay.
being like, that's of interest to me. I could see myself there.
And was that from maybe the media, or did you have a relative that was in the military? Did you see any military people in your neighborhood?
I think it's a combination of,
Okay.
of things, probably. So certainly I did have some relatives that were in the military,
Okay.
and some of the stories that they had told me, some of the things that they had showed me from their time in the military, I thought were really cool.
Okay.
Of course, media depictions of the military can really go one of two ways. They can portray them as like these superheroes, or they can portray them as these super villains. But media portrayals certainly didn't hurt my impression of the
Yeah.
military and my tendency to view it very fondly, especially as a child. And then my parents growing up, partly because of the relatives that we had, they were very much instilling like respect for the armed forces, for first responders, these people that take on risks, like personally, to try to help other people. And so, especially when I was younger, I was like, that is something that I think is, noble, respectable, and something that I would like to do someday. So I think that would probably mostly be what contributed, yeah.
Oh, nice. Now, I know the military is a very challenging task.
It can be.
Did you fully understand the task that you were taking upon yourself before you signed up? Did anyone explain to you that this is potentially a tough one?
I would love to have told you, yes, I knew exactly what I was getting into. I knew exactly what I was taking on. And there is a time in my life, right before I went off and signed up and went to basic training and all that I would have told you, I know what I'm getting myself into. Turns out, not quite. As most things happen in life, there was a few surprises, a few like little plot twists, if you will. I think in several ways I knew, I knew so long, so early in my life and for so long of my life that that's what I had wanted to do when I was growing up. I had done a lot of reading up on the different branches, what to expect from different branches, kind of different goals and overall missions and purposes of the branches, that kind of thing. So I thought I was really well prepared. And in some ways I was prepared. Before I went to basic training, I had researched. I was like, I know this phase of basic training happens where they have you do this kind of stuff. But of course they don't make everything so publicly available. And there's going to be differences between like who your drill sergeants are and what job you end up selecting within the Army or whatever branch you pick. For me, it was Army, of course. So it's, I would want to have told you, yes. But there were certainly some things I expected and some things I did not.
Okay, cool. I was listening to an interview by The Rock.
Okay.
This famous, I don't know even what, is he a wrestler or he's a bodybuilder? I don't know which one it is. Maybe both.
I think, he definitely was a wrestler at one point.
Yeah.
I don't know that he wrestles anymore.
Okay.
I'm not really
And I heard
too
that.
into the wrestling scene, but I know he acts now.
Yeah.
And I know he's done like a little bit of television hosting here and there. And I know he's jacked. He's a very, very ripped guy.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
whether he's professionally a bodybuilder or not, I
Yeah.
think functionally he's
Yeah.
probably a
Okay.
bodybuilder.
You're right about that. So I was listening to an interview that he granted. I think it was a podcast or something like that,
Okay.
in which he said that when he was going to school, as a young person, he faced a lot of bullying at school.
Mhm.
And so out of that, he got frustrated a lot, oftentimes that he could not fight back.
Mm.
So for that reason, he started going to the gym,
Yeah.
trying to build up some muscle
Hmm.
to defend himself.
Yeah.
So that was the original plan, just to defend himself,
Sure.
all right? But as he hit the gym and he kept exercising, he realized that he was building up muscle that eventually it was more than protecting himself.
Yeah.
Now he has created a career which is entirely around his physique,
Yeah.
right? A lot of times we pick up some professions as a way of dealing with some vulnerabilities within ourselves, some
Mhm.
experiences some negative experiences that we encountered either growing up or at a point, even it could be in our late, adult
Mhm.
life. And the military is one of such places where people feel like, if I want to show my masculinity,
Hmm.
the military is where I have to go. If I want to show that I cannot be bullied, the military is where I have to go. Because once you get into the military, it is assumed that you are strong enough,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, there's a
And-
bit of an
and-
assumption that you
yeah.
can carry yourself. and
Exactly, you can
handle
carry yourself, and
yeah.
there's some amount of social respectability to it, right?
For most
So,
people, yeah.
so in terms of not just physically
Mhm.
being able to defend yourself, or people thinking, oh well, let me back up from him because he's a military person, I don't want to get there. But also in terms of social recognition, which a
Mhm.
lot of people lack these days because of so much competition in terms of social media, comparing yourself with other people.
Yeah.
A lot of people lack that social. They are not comfortable with it within themselves. They are not comfortable with themselves. They feel like they could do more.
Yeah, maybe you feel they can boost their social standing.
Exactly. So my question is, do you feel that at any point your experiences, especially going into your new school,
Hmm.
where you were the odd one out,
Hmm.
odd,
Sure,
in code,
yeah,
not
yeah.
necessarily that you're not a psycho, right?
Right. Not that I know of.
You were the odd one out, and you had to stand up for yourself. You had to, and you had to affirm yourself,
Yeah.
right? Do you think like experiences like that also played a role in you choosing the military?
I think maybe underlying, like kind of under the surface. I don't think it was ever really like a conscious thought of mine.
Yeah.
But I think there might have been a little bit of, I always kind of sympathized or felt bad for people who were bullied.
Mm-hmm.
There's been times where I witnessed bullying and I stepped in.
Mm-hmm.
There's been times where I witnessed bullying and I wish I would have stepped in, but I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe some of that would have influenced my decision
Yeah.
to, especially prior to entering the military,
Yeah.
one of my conceptualizations
Yeah.
of it was it would offer me a chance to help people who have trouble helping themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not that actually was
Yeah.
the case could be debated.
Yeah.
For sure.
Okay.
But that was certainly a conceptualization I had of it, so
Yeah.
I'm sure to a degree.
Yeah. A lot of times, some of these considerations are not too apparent to us.
Yeah.
They are some subconscious things that that we just have because we are not really going around saying we want to do this to improve our image or to improve our standing or to fight back at some amount of vulnerability. So
Sure.
sometimes we try to avoid our vulnerabilities. Basically, as human beings, we try to avoid that. So certain situations like that, I can understand the situations where people are not conscious of it,
Yeah.
of some of these things. But as you said, sometimes it could actually be Not that it triggers, but it actually affirms a decision that you have already taken.
Yeah, reinforces.
Yeah.
Kind of how you see it.
Exactly. Exactly.
And I don't know that the social status was ever really a consideration for me. Maybe when I was younger, there might have been some of it. But that was never really why I went in. But I think certainly the part about kind of like the vulnerable people and trying to help them, I think was probably a little bit more under the surface.
Cool.
I'm sure there was some underlying desire to have, you know, that status. But at least today and for most of the time that I spent in the military, that was not really like a salient conscious factor.
Yeah. Cool. Well, it's getting interesting and interesting. Okay, now, how was training like? Once you joined and they told you, okay, now come for training. How was it? You know, how did you feel? And when you started, walk us through training.
Well, so training, of course, is going to look a little different for each branch. It's going to look a little bit different for each job within each branch. They have something called basic combat training, which is kind of like your more standardized training program or regimen that you would go through for any job. And then you have, for most jobs, what they would call OSA, one-stop unit training. Or sorry, for most jobs it would be AIT, advanced individual training. So you would get your basic kind of catch-all training, and then you would go somewhere else and you would be trained on your job specifically. Certain jobs like the infantry, which is where I was, I think military police is another one. They kind of lump your basic training and your job specific training all into one thing, and they call it OSA, one-stop unit training. So that was my experience as an infantryman. I just had that one stop where it was more or less all lumped together. To kind of take you through the start of it, I think you asked, right? That was a really interesting experience, one that I don't know I've quite had anything like. You know, when I joined, I was 17, needed parental consent forms and all of that, and so I found myself the day before you join, or the day before you ship out to your training, rather, you go to this thing called MEPS, and at MEPS, it's the Military Entrance Processing Station. Most major cities have one. You can go to whichever one's closest to where you signed up, and they'll give you a final physical, ask you some questions. I think there's like a final drug test. These kind of check the box formalities, and from there you show up to there the night before. They put you in a hotel. You wake up with all the other people who are getting ready to ship out to their different branches at like 4-something, 5-something in the morning, and then you go and you're being screened and you're doing all these different things, answering these questions, taking these tests, whatever. Several of which I'd taken before when I initially signed up because they had to put you through physicals and whatnot. Some of which were skipped from the first time to the second. Some weren't as redundant, you know. And then they send you off, and they're like, all right, we're gonna put you in the airport. Here's your ticket, find the gate, don't miss it. And then, you know, for me, the set of instructions was, when you get off the plane, there's a clock tower in the airport in Atlanta. You go wait by the clock tower, and then some guy in a military uniform with a brown round is what we called it. They didn't call it that. They just basically said a brown hat, the like stereotypical drill sergeant hat, is gonna come find you. And when he gets there, do what he says. And so there I am, kind of unsure of what to expect, sitting next to a bunch of other people by this clock tower, some of which were just there by happenstance and some of which had received, you know, very similar instructions to me. And there was certainly excitement there, but there was nerves as well. You know, as much as I thought that I knew what to expect, there was kind of, this is where the realization started to set in, maybe I don't know exactly what to expect. And so I remember distinctly, I watched this guy from across the airport, and he had like a brown fedora that looked kind of like a brown hat, or a brown drill sergeant hat at like first glance. And he was wearing a Hawaiian shirt, so there was like rapid color changing, and it almost, for a first glance, looked like camouflage. And by then, like, I'd been up for like 14 hours straight, which like isn't that long, but it felt like a long time. Travel, uncertainty, all those things. I was very tired. So I saw him, and my stomach just kind of like was in my throat all of a sudden, like, oh, like, is this it? It was not. So then 20 minutes or so goes by, and there comes the drill sergeant for real this time, and I was kind of expecting just like he's gonna start yelling at us in this airport in front of everybody. But that didn't happen. The yelling did come, but it didn't come right then. And so they took us to this little wing of the airport where they had like a little government room set up, and they had us like give them some information to put into a system and process and confirm that we'd arrived and all that. And we're all standing there like back to back outside, and 2 drill sergeants are helping like get things settled, and 2 drill sergeants are out watching a line of people. And it was almost like we were a spectacle, because everybody in the very crowded airport walking by is like, what is happening there? And so that was interesting. After that took maybe an hour or 2, I don't really remember. We ended up on a bus ride that the drill sergeants told us, if you're gonna sleep, do it now. This is your last chance for a while. And so I slept through, I don't know how long the bus ride, hour, 2 hours, something like that. And next thing you know, we're waking up to the sounds of people yelling. And there's bright lights outside the bus, even though it's like middle of the night, pitch black, other than the bright lights. And there's a bunch more dudes in the brown hats who are all like standing with their arms crossed, taking some sort of like power pose, and 2 or 3 of them are on the bus and they're yelling, "Get your stuff, get off," And I was like, okay, this is what I was expecting a little bit more of. And then, oh man, for the first like week that you're there, sometimes more, sometimes a little less, you're at what they call the reception battalion, and you're not doing any training. You're getting your uniforms, you're getting your head shaved, you're getting your boots, you're being told the basics of like how to stand at attention, how to stand at parade rest. You're doing some like basic PT exercises, but you're not really in basic training yet. And so I was there for maybe about a week, week and a half, and then we went to basic training, where they handed us off from one group of yelling people in brown hats to a different group of yelling people in brown hats. And so we were handed to our basic training company, and when we go there, they put you on a bus, and you have 2 duffel bags full of a bunch of stuff you didn't have when you arrived, and then you have your little bag of personal items. And so what they did is they had everybody like get their stuff, and you had both your bags, and you were single file down this little aisle of the bus, and you get off the bus, and these guys are yelling at you, and they're putting hands up in your face like that. And
why are they yelling though? Because you're already complying, right? So why are they yelling?
So this is something that I don't know if they do it anymore or not. Basic training has changed throughout time and throughout history. So when I went through it, it was probably a lot easier than it was 20 years prior. And certainly a lot different, if not easier, but I'm willing to bet easier as well. And then like during, people that are going through it now are probably having a bit of a different experience to me. I'm only about 10 years removed from that experience. So they call it the shark attack, and it's supposed to just instill stress.
Okay.
It's supposed to make you overwhelmed, a lot of things going on.
Purposely stressing you to see how you handle it.
Yeah, how do you process it? How do you react?
Okay.
Get used, the way I see it, maybe this isn't exactly why it is, but the way I see it looking back is it's the start of them trying to make you comfortable being uncomfortable. So they have you throw your bags in a pile, and so there's how many kids on these buses? There's like 3 or 4 buses, each one's got like 30, 40, 50 kids, whatever. And so we're all throwing our duffel bags into the same place, into this one big pile, and they're all exactly the same, minus the fact that like there's a little plastic slip this big that has our name on it, but otherwise they're all the exact same duffel bag, the exact same color. And they yell at you, go over here and get in formation. Once you get in formation, they're yelling at you. While you're running to drop your bags off and get into formation, there's like smoke grenades going off, and there's people with machine guns in the wood line, and they're firing blank rounds. So, of course no projectiles are coming, but you hear the sound of, or a version of the sound of gunfire. It's a little different hearing a blank round versus a real one. They're like dropping these little things called artillery simulators, which are just kind of almost think like a little firework that just goes like. And so of course it's very, very unsettling and unfamiliar to somebody who's never done anything like that, which is the goal. Once you get in formation, they're yelling at you like, okay, now go get your bags that you just threw in that pile. And of course my first thought is, well, why the hell did I throw it in a pile if I have to just go get it?
Did you have your name on it?
Yeah, we all had our names on it, but they gave us, you know, an unreasonable and just straight up unaccomplishable time frame to sort through. I don't know, like 100 people's bags times 2-3 bags per person, you know, and they're like, go find your bag and get everyone back in formation. You have 3 minutes to sort it out. Go. And of course, 3 minutes is not enough time, and they know it, and they expect you to fail, and then they punish you for your failure. You know, do some push-ups or yell at you or whatever they choose to do. So that's kind of the introduction to training. Yeah, and then from there, that's where you really started. Like, you got assigned your weapon, you got assigned your bunk mate, who they referred to as your battle buddy. You were supposed to kind of go everywhere with them, and it was at that point kind of orienting. This is what your life is like for the next, you know, 13, 14, 15 weeks, whatever, however long your training program is going to be. I think at the time that I went through my training program was like 13 or 14 weeks. And then they start, you know, over the course of the 13, 14 weeks, of course, they're getting you into shape, or better shape. They're teaching you like how to properly wear your uniform, teaching you the very basics of getting your gear set up, the very basics of like tactical movements, tactical considerations. They teach the real basic gist of like hand-to-hand combat things. Not a whole lot. I was actually very surprised at how little the Army made that part of just like the basic training program. The Marines are actually better at doing hand-to-hand combat as part of their basic training program. That's one thing I think the Marines definitely have over the Army. Though I could certainly come up with things I think the Army has over the Marines. Granted, of course, I'm biased. But yeah, that's kind of really the start of the training experience. But the training never really stops.
Yeah.
So when you get to your unit, you just start training with the unit, so you can be familiar of how the people in your unit work. Each unit has different, we call them SOPs, like standard operating procedures. So you've got to learn all the specific ways that your unit approaches different things, and the tactical mindset of the people in your unit and the leaders in your unit. How to work with them, how to function in different roles within the unit, all those different things. So.
Great.
Yeah, the training never really stops, but looks a little different beyond basic training, kind of depending on your unit and your role.
Cool. Thanks. So from a lot of the description that you've given, I will ask this question, and it's going to be a two-in-one kind of question. Okay. What does the word resilience mean in the context of that experience that you just narrated? And two, how do you think your culture or your background helped you to navigate through those situations?
Okay, yeah. So to me, resilience in that situation was just getting through it, and getting through it in one piece. You know, I didn't necessarily always have to enjoy it, didn't necessarily always have to have the best attitude about it. Though if I had a bad attitude and the drill sergeants called on, they would sure let me know. So I would say resilience is just taking whatever the challenges of the situation in that moment are, and just finding a way to get through. So whether that's, you know, in basic training, some of the challenges might be going on. Like the first time I ever did a 12-mile road march was in basic training, and I didn't know how to pack my rucksack very efficiently yet to like make it easier or like better to carry. So by the end of that 12-mile road march, not only was I sore and in pain because like I'd never done something like that. That was the first time my body experienced walking 12 miles with some heavy crap on my back, you know. But I packed it like crap too. So it was, the weight was all like unevenly distributed, and so the resilience there looks a little bit differently than like the resilience of just like running through that smoke grenade while a guy yells at you. Oh, that's a fire alarm.
Okay. That's